Hello, my name is Chad Hutchinson. I'm a third-year DMA student at the University of Minnesota, currently studying orchestral conducting. It's my pleasure today to be able to talk about the life of Maurice Duruflé. When we really think about major composers, and especially thinking of requiems as we're studying Duruflé's Requiem, he isn't one that readily comes to mind. We definitely think of Brahms, we think of Verdi and Mozart for sure, probably Fauré, and then Duruflé has kind of been resignated, maybe not quite on that same level. And unfortunately, this has happened throughout time, and through today's study and through more performances of this piece, hopefully that can be rectified and it brought to its prominent and proper prevalence in the musical hierarchy of great requiems that have been composed. Duruflé was an interesting person. He lived in the 20th century, which was something that I hadn't thought of. I always thought of Duruflé being a late romantic, but he was born in 1902 and died in 1986, so fairly recently. The story goes that when he was 10, his dad took him to Rouen, and he was really excited about getting to leave the city, to get out and to go someplace new. What he didn't realize was that his dad was taking him there and was then returning home and leaving him there. He was said to have sobbed repeatedly at night until he finally found a comfort here, and he became a chorister at the Rouen Cathedral Choir. He later took up both piano and organ, studying with Jules Healing, and by age 17 he started to move to Paris, which is the epicenter of all that was kind of going on musically in the early 20th century. He started taking organ lessons with the best of the time, including Tournemire and Guillemot. As a former trombonist, we played Morceau Symphonique by Guillemot, which is a very famous piece that he wrote. So he's in Paris, and what do we know about Paris in the 20th century? Who's the composer? Stravinsky. And we know of Stravinsky writing both Firebird Suite. He writes The Rite of Spring, obviously, Petrushka. All of these are happening very close to the time that Duruflé is in Paris as well. We then later have the teacher Nadia Boulanger, who takes many other composers and everything under her wing as well, and makes Paris into a place that everybody wants to go to. At age 25, he became the assistant to Louis Vienne at Notre Dame. And a couple years later then, became the organist at Saint-Étienne-du-Mont in Paris, a position that he held for the rest of his life. He loved Paris. He wanted to stay there. We see this in the fact that he stayed the rest of his life, but also he wanted to give back. And so he taught at the Paris Conservatory for over 30 years. He was known in the entire musician community of Paris, most specifically working with Poulenc. Poulenc wrote an organ concerto and he wanted some extra insight, and Duruflé was able to help work on the registrations of the orchestra part. Basically, when we think of registrations, it's very similar to orchestration. One of the master orchestrators of the time, Stravinsky, and the different colors that he could portray. Registration is the same thing. We have multiple ranks of an organ. We have all kinds of different, what we call stops, and different lengths of pipes with different colors and sounds. So basically you have a huge switchboard at your disposal, much like a conductor when they conduct an orchestra or a chorus for the first time, being able to try to draw out the correct colors. So it's quite amazing that Poulenc would come to Duruflé and ask him basically to help rewrite portions of his organ concerto to make it really work in a new and profound way. He later married Marie Chevalier, who was also an organist and was one of his former assistants. They went on to create a famous, not piano duo, an organ duo. An organ duo of the time where they toured all the way through the 1960s and 1970s. I mean, how cool would it be if your spouse is traveling around with you and you just get to play music all day? My spouse is a physician. It doesn't quite work that way. But it's really great that he was able to have that. Unfortunately, the later years of his life were not as jolly. He was in a very severe car accident where one account said that he was hit by another vehicle going 93 miles an hour. He and his wife were both thrown from the car. His legs were broken, and his organ career was pretty much finished due to all of the injuries that he sustained during this time. However, he did find time to write one more piece. And we're going to listen to that right now. It's a version of the Lord's Prayer. And he composed this 1 year after his accident. Enjoy.
Notre Père qui es aux cieux, que ton nom soit sanctifié, que ton règne vienne, que ta volonté soit faite sur la terre comme au ciel. Donne-nous aujourd'hui notre pain de ce jour. Pardonne-nous nos offenses, comme nous pardonnons aussi à ceux qui nous ont offensés. Et ne nous sauvez pas à la tentation, mais délivre-nous du mal.
So when we hear that, do we really think 20th century composer? To me, I hear that and it harkens back to an earlier time, something that is more timeless and something that definitely would be written 100, 200 years earlier than what we had heard. And that's kind of the magic of Duruflé, is the fact that he's able to bring in ideas from the past and put them with 20th century harmonies. And it's something that we'll explore even more as we get closer and in more depth of dealing with the Requiem. So he wrote this piece a year after his car accident, and then basically didn't write anything for the rest of his life. He ended up dying in 1986 at the age of 84. As a composer, he was very self-critical, to the point of somebody that reminds me a lot of Brahms. You know, we think of Brahms, and when Beethoven wrote his 9th Symphony, Brahms did not write his 1st symphony until over 10 years after Beethoven had died. And he talked about this large looming figure being in the shadow of Beethoven and trying to break through that idea and that weight that was upon his shoulders. Duruflé seems to be kind of in that same camp of not really wanting to just put out piece after piece after piece. He was much more detailed and much more conscientious of his own work. He only published a small number of works. 14 at this point have been identified. He would often edit them, change them after publication. Some pieces he completely changes the ending, other pieces he changes the tempo. One piece was supposed to start and then gradually accelerate all the way to the end. He ended up changing that. He would change orchestration, again, kind of how the instruments are put together and how everything fits. He was best known as an organ composer, as well as for the Requiem, which was written in 1947, and a Mass, which was written in 1967. He said he was incapable of adding anything significant to the pianoforte repertoire, views the string quartet with apprehension, and envisages with terror the idea of composing a song after the finished examples of Schubert, Fauré, and Debussy. Now, the pianoforte was something that Beethoven was writing with. It's not the piano that we know of today. It was that of which followed the harpsichord. We had the harpsichord, then the pianoforte, and then the piano, pretty much as we know it today. But you can see from this quote how much Duruflé is kind of reflecting and saying, I don't feel that I can add to this repertoire. So he decided to go in a different direction, that being the organ. Now, we'd had major composers that had written for organ, but he kind of found his own niche and went from there. One of my favorite quotes for him is he says, I work slowly, I throw a lot away. And think of that scene around the desk with all kinds of little pieces of paper that just have been tossed aside. The first piece he wrote in 1926 was a triptych for piano, and it is marked in very large red letters, not to be published. In an open interview later, Duruflé said he showed disdain for one of his most performed works, the organ toccata. He says the first theme is very bad. Obviously, since the theme is an essential part of a composition, the composition cannot succeed if the theme is bad. So he obviously thought very highly of his works. It was something that I'll leave this up to you to decide. This is a little bit of his toccata, one of his most famous organ works. Please enjoy. So when I hear that toccata, to me it reminds me of another famous organ composer, of Vidor. The toccata of Vidor, the last movement, sounds very similar to what we just heard of Duruflé. I have one more short piece to share with you of Duruflé before we get into the Requiem. This is his Mass, written 20 years after the Requiem. And this is the Kyrie movement. And I think you'll start to hear some of these beautiful French colors that Duruflé elicits from the text Kyrie eleison, Christe eleison, Kyrie eleison. So now we transition into the Requiem, the piece that he probably is most known for in the choral world, and an absolutely beautiful setting of the Requiem Mass text. It's originally based on Gregorian chant and described as, quote, an astoundingly successful compromise between musical styles 1400 years apart. Because we have this Gregorian chant idea that runs throughout the Requiem, which my colleagues will talk about, and then throwing it into the 20th century, in the middle of the 20th century, we get this amazing juxtaposition that happens. This wasn't just something that was unique to Duruflé. Stravinsky was doing something very similar around the same time. In Stravinsky's case, they called this neoclassicism, and where he would take older ideas and bring them into a newer concept. Oftentimes the Fauré Requiem is compared with the Duruflé Requiem, but Duruflé himself didn't see this. He felt that it was influenced more, and he was more influenced by Debussy and Ravel, especially in how it's constructed. First composition for chorus, and originally this was dedicated to his father. So he had not written choral pieces up to this point. And so to take on a Requiem as your first choral piece is a pretty huge deal, and it's something that he obviously did very well. He conducted the premiere, as I said, in 1947. Now, we talked earlier about how Duruflé liked to really mess with things as far as revising and changing and such. He created 3 different versions of the Requiem. One for organ and chorus, a chamber orchestra version for chamber orchestra and chorus, and finally a version for full orchestra, organ, and chorus. So the same text has completely different feels in each of these settings, and it's one of the things that makes the Duruflé Requiem unique and something that has transcended time. Duruflé himself said of his Requiem the following, and these are some program notes that he had in the score. This Requiem is not an ethereal work which signs and sings of detachment from earthly worries. It reflects in the immutable form of the Christian prayer, the agony of man faced with the mystery of his ultimate end. It is often dramatic or filled with resignation or hope or terror, just as the words of the scripture themselves, which are used in the liturgy. It tends to translate human feelings before their terrifying, unexplainable, or consoling destiny. This Mass includes the 9 parts of the Mass of the Dead, the Introit, the Kyrie, Domine Jesu Christe, Sanctus, Pie Jesu, Agnus Dei, Lux Aeterna, and Libera Me, and finally, In Paradisum. The ultimate answer of faith to all the questions by the flight of the soul to paradise. Very rarely do we get a composer to expound this deeply and this intricately on one of their works. So to have this little snippet of insight from Duruflé about his own Requiem is something that scholars and musicians have pondered, studied, and contemplated over for many years. So how is it put together and how is it constructed? My colleagues will take it from here, but I'll leave you with this last little bit. A former student said of the origins of the piece, Duruflé had been working on a suite of pieces for organ based on the chant melodies of the Requiem. At first he intended to write 4 or 5 pieces inspired by the Requiem themes. He already had composed a Lux Aeterna and a Sanctus. Then he began to realize that the texts of these plain chants should not be separated from the melodies. So he began to transform his composed pieces and add them for a work with voice and orchestra. So I hope you've learned a little bit about Duruflé's life, how he was very intricate in his writing, some of the other pieces, that being the Toccata, the Mass, and his last piece he wrote, the Lord's Prayer. And now enjoy a more in-depth look at the Requiem of Maurice Duruflé. Thank you.